My son pushed me at the Christmas table for his rich in-laws, so I took everything he owned. Samuel's clock shop smelled of machine oil and pine, the table lamplight pouring down on the tiny gears like stardust. By the window, the winter wind pressed against the cold glass. On the table, the velvet box containing the clock, engraved with CH, lay still as a secret. The wall bells rang regularly, tick-tock, keeping the room warm and orderly. "Sell the house," Mark said. His tie tightened, his eyes not daring to touch his mother's photo frame. "That land is worth more than memories." Samuel put down the screwdriver, the metal clicking dry. "Your mother planted roses in that yard." His mother's voice rang out from the old recording. Samuel had accidentally played "Warm, Thin." "Mark, don't trade your family for impressions." Mark let out a short laugh. "Mom's gone. Times have changed. And they're all the gooding." Samuel looked straight ahead. "No, you're different. If progress means erasing what makes you human, then you've progressed further than I thought. I bet 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past without clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you, and where are you listening?" The letter came on a Wednesday, slipped halfway through the door, perfumed faintly with something expensive and impersonal, like a handshake that didn't linger. Inside, embossed in gold, was the Hamilton family crest. Samuel turned it over, read his son's handwriting tidy, newly practiced, trying too hard. "You're invited to the Hamiltons' Christmas celebration, December 23rd, 7 p.m. Formal attire." Below it, Mark had scribbled, "It would mean a lot if you came, Dad, Resin Avery." He stood in the middle of his workshop for a long moment, surrounded by the slow, faithful ticking of clocks. The room smelled of machine oil, brass polish, and the faint sweetness of pine from the sawdust on the floor. Outside, the winter wind pressed against the window like a child's cold hand. Samuel's workshop had always been a world apart. A modest place, narrow, warm, cluttered, but everything in it obeyed a kind of gentle order. He liked the sound of metal settling, of time keeping its promises. The rest of the world, he learned, did not. He placed the invitation under a paperweight shaped like a gear and went back to what he trusted, repairing an old pocket watch, the last one he and Clara had made together before she fell ill. It had belonged to a local teacher, a woman who wanted it to tick again after 40 years of silence, but it meant more than that to him. It was their final collaboration. Her hands had engraved the initials on the inside, C.H. Her initials, small as breath. She called it the heart of our family. Now, with the lamps burning low, he turned the tiny screw that held the balance spring. It trembled once, then steadied into motion, the faint tick-tick echoing through the quiet. He smiled without meaning to. The phone rang a sound that no longer startled him, only interrupted. He wiped his fingers on a cloth before answering. "Hayes Clockworks," he said. "Dad, you got my message?" Mark's voice, cheerful but tense. In the background came the clinking of glasses, the tinny swell of office laughter. "Yes," Samuel said. "The invitation came this morning." "Good, that's good." A pause, and then the voice dropped lower, impatient. "Listen, I know these things aren't really your scene, but it's important this year. Catherine's parents, well, you know how they are. They're formal. It would really mean a lot if you came. A nod, There was a sound of laughter again, someone calling Mark's name. Something about a toast. Samuel waited. "I'll come," he said simply. Mark sighed, relieved. "Thanks, Dad. Just try to look sharp, okay? Maybe wear that navy blazer, not the old sweater, you know the one. It's a big night." The words settled like dust. "Of course," Samuel said. "Perfect. You're the best." Then a click, and the laughter swallowed his son whole. For a moment, Samuel stood still, phone still pressed to his ear. The clock above the workbench struck 7. The sound measured. Patient felt more human than the call had. He replaced the receiver gently. The silence after a call was different from the silence before one, he thought. It always was. He looked at the half-polished watch on the table. Clara would have known what to do, how to interpret that invitation, how to read between the lines of their son's voice. She'd have smiled, maybe rolled her eyes, and then said, "Go anyway. Just don't forget who you are." He sat down, fingers trembling slightly as he fitted the watch into its velvet box. The metal gleamed softly, as if holding its breath. He imagined walking into that house, his son's new world of glass and gold, and handing the box over. Not to show off, not to intrude, but to remind Mark of where he came from. The true inheritance wasn't money or marble or the right cut of suit. It was this: work done well, time honored, love made visible through hands. He ran a thumb across the engraving CH. Still perfect after all these years. Your mother would have liked that, he murmured. A bit of grace in all this nonsense. That night, he ironed the navy blazer. He took down his only silk tie, still smelling faintly of cedar. Before bed, he wound the clocks, every single one, listening to the rhythm rise and overlap. In their steady ticking, he could almost hear her again, the faint hum of Clara's laugh in the workshop, the sound of her saying, "There's beauty in things that take time." When he finally turned off the light, the last thing he saw was the velvet box on the table. He smiled at it, the way one smiles at an old photograph. It wasn't just a gift, it was a bridge. And for that reason alone, he decided to go. The Hamilton mansion was less a house than a performance. The columns wore wreaths, the driveway sparkled with imported gravel, and the chandeliers visible from the street burned like trophies. Even the air smelled expensive, a mix of citrus and pine, the kind used in five-star hotels to suggest moral cleanliness. Samuel arrived on time, which, in this world, made him early. He handed his coat to a valet, who thanked him without looking up. Inside, the warmth was heavy and perfumed. Conversations floated like champagne bubbles. He stood near the doorway, unsure where to stand in a place that didn't seem to have edges. Through the glass doors, he saw a vast room glowing under golden lights. At the far end, a grand marble fireplace reflected every movement like a stage mirror. Guests clustered around the man, standing before it tall, silver-haired, perfectly still. Alistair Hamilton, he presumed. The patriarch, the shark. Mark spotted him across the room. "Dad," he said, too brightly, threading through guests. "You made it. Great." He looked immaculate in a tailored suit, but his smile was thin, twitching at the edges. "Listen, everything's just moving fast tonight, but it's great you are here." Samuel smiled. "I brought something for you and Catherine. Thought it might be the right time." Mark's eyes flicked toward the crowd, then back. "Sure, but maybe later, okay? It's busy." He disappeared before Samuel could answer. For half an hour, Samuel watched people flow around him as if he were invisible. Waiters offered him champagne and took it away before he could answer. He drifted toward the fireplace, the room's heart, where Alistair held court like a benign monarch. Every laugh seemed timed to his. Samuel's hand brushed the pocket of his blazer. The velvet box was there, warm against his side. He waited for a pause, a chance. When Mark finally reappeared flushed, talking fast, Samuel stepped forward. "Mark," he said quietly, "I wanted to give you this now, before the evening gets too busy." He took out the box. Small, neat, understated. Mark froze. A quick look around, too many eyes. His hand darted out, not to receive the gift, but to stop it. His fingers pressed lightly against his father's wrist, a silent command. "Dad, not now," he whispered through clenched teeth. "I told you." The gesture was subtle, almost tender from a distance. Only Samuel felt the weight behind it. His son's voice was soft but sharp, like glass under cloth. Mark turned immediately to the fireplace. "Sir Alistair," he said loudly, his tone transformed. "Speaking of legacy, I wanted to tell you our Phoenix project just secured its second round of funding." The air seemed to tilt. Alistair looked down from his effortless height, expression unreadable. "Oh?" "Yes," Mark continued, suddenly animated. "We're expanding. Sustainable materials, municipal partnerships, real innovation. We're bringing life back to cities that burned out." Samuel stood beside them, the box still in his hand, invisible as wallpaper. He listened to his son talk about millions, investors, impact, and felt a slow ache begin to pulse behind his ribs. Clara had always said their boy had her heart and Samuel's hands. Now it seemed he'd traded both for someone else's approval. Mark kept talking. "Faster now. filling the air with words the way nervous people fill silence. We just need the right kind of mentorship, he said, looking up at Alistair. Someone who understands legacy. Alistair's eyes flicked once toward Samuel's half-lowered gift, then back to Mark. He said nothing. Instead, his mouth curved slightly. It wasn't a smile. It was an autopsy of one. It was the look of a man who had thrown meat into a pit and was watching which dog barked first. Impressive, he murmured finally. And how much of this phoenix belongs to you? Mark's throat bobbed. 20%, sir. But with your guidance? Alistair lifted a hand. We'll see. The conversation died neatly at his word. Around them, laughter resumed as if on cue. Someone clinked a glass. The spell broke. Mark exhaled, forcing another bright smile. We'll talk more later, sir. Enjoy the party. He turned back toward Samuel. Dad, why don't you maybe get some food? They've got lobster rolls. Then he was gone again, swallowed by the crowd. Samuel stood there, the watch still in his box, his hand trembling slightly. He looked down at it, then up at the gleaming room, and realized no one had noticed. Not the offering, not the refusal, not him. He slipped the box back into his pocket. The ticking inside was faint but steady. He thought of Clara again, how she'd warned him that time could wound as precisely as it healed. Across the room, Alistair's eyes met his. Just for a moment, a faint smirk approval, amusement. Pity crossed the man's face, gone as quickly as it came. And Samuel understood. The test wasn't for him. It was for Mark. And Mark was failing it spectacularly. The humiliation settled over him like snow, soft, quiet, covering everything. But beneath it, something colder began to form. Not anger, understanding. His son was no longer the boy who'd helped polish clock cases in the back room. He was an actor now, desperate, over-rehearsed, performing for a man who didn't believe in scripts. Samuel straightened, his reflection caught in the marble. Small, solid, enduring. He touched the watch through his pocket. It still ticked. So did he, and for the first time that night, he stopped hoping. He simply observed like a craftsman studying a machine that no longer told the truth about time. The party had reached that polished, dangerous quiet between speeches and dessert when everyone had drunk just enough to feel pleased with their own importance. Samuel slipped away toward the far corridor, where the light dimmed and the air lost its perfume. His reflection followed him in the glass panels. An old man in a navy blazer, slightly out of place in a house that looked allergic to warmth. He had nearly reached the end of the hallway when he heard a smooth voice behind him. Mr. Hayes, Alistair Hamilton said, his tone soft as polished stone. You look as if you could use a moment of peace. Samuel turned. Alistair's smile was the same one he'd worn all night, thin, effortless, predatory. Join me, he said. I find the library's the only honest room in this house. The invitation wasn't a favor. It was a command dressed in silk. The library was vast and masculine, smelling faintly of leather, oak, and something sweetly smoky success. Distilled, a globe the size of a small car stood in one corner. The desk gleamed like a piano lid. Alistair poured 2 glasses of brandy and handed one across. To peace and progress, he said. Samuel only nodded, the glass warm in his hand, but he didn't drink. I've wanted a word, Alistair began, sitting with the confidence of a man who'd bought the chair. Mark's a fine young man, ambitious. Sometimes too ambitious, but that's forgivable. It's what keeps the world turning. Samuel waited. Compliments from men like this were never gifts. They were openings. Alistair leaned forward. He's been very enthusiastic about a venture of ours. Project Phoenix. Have you heard of it? Samuel shook his head. Well, then. Alistair smiled the way a magician smiles before revealing that the card was in your pocket all along. He reached into a drawer and unrolled a map across the desk. Renderings of towers, plazas, and pedestrian bridges gleamed under the lamplight. The drawings were beautiful in a sterile, soulless way, like the smile of a salesman who knows he's already closed the deal. This, Alistair said, tapping the page, is the future. A mixed-use development. Billions in investment. We've secured nearly every parcel of land except one. His finger rested on a small white square at the edge of the project. Samuel leaned closer. The map swam for a moment, then resolved into something painfully familiar. His own street. his own home. Alistair's tone softened. You recognize it? Of course. Samuel stared. The room seemed to shrink. Your son, Alistair continued smoothly, has assured me that you understand the importance of progress, that you wouldn't let emotions interfere with opportunity. He said you'd see reason. Samuel looked up slowly. He told you that? He did. Alistair lifted his glass but didn't drink. Mark's loyal, and loyalty deserves reward. If this last parcel can be secured quickly, the project will move forward and your son will move with it. A vice presidency, perhaps, a new life. He's quite the salesman. The smile that followed was gentle, almost paternal, which made it worse. Samuel said nothing. The map glowed faintly under the light, that one pale square staring back like an eye that refused to close. You should be proud, Alistair went on, pretending courtesy. Not many fathers have a chance to give their sons a legacy like this. Samuel finally spoke. A legacy, he said softly, built on selling the house his mother died in. For a moment, something flickered across Alistair's expression, amusement, maybe pity. Mr. Hayes, sentimentality is a poor substitute for vision. Time moves forward. Cities do too. You can either be part of it or be erased by it. The words were mild, but their precision cut deep. Samuel placed his brandy on the desk. His hand was steady. You think this will make me sell? I think, Alistair said, that you love your son, and love has always been more persuasive than money. The truth in that sentence was almost unbearable. He could see now how neatly it all fit together. Mark's sudden calls, his insistence that Samuel come tonight, the watch brush aside, the public humiliation, it hadn't been thoughtless. It had been rehearsal, softening him up, making him feel smaller, grateful even before the real request arrived. It wasn't Mark's idea. It was Alistair's. But Mark had agreed to play the part. Alistair stood, smoothing his jacket. I'll leave you to think, but I'd advise not waiting too long. Delay can be expensive. He gathered the papers and slid them back into their case. And, Mr. Hayes, between us, Mark has great potential. Don't be the reason he never gets to prove it. Then he smiled, a perfect crescent of civility, and left. The door closed softly behind him. For a long time, Samuel didn't move. He stared at the empty space where the plans had been. His fingers found the velvet pouch inside his blazer, the watch, still ticking, faithful as breath. Now he understood. The entire evening had been a test of manners, of pride, of how easily an old man could be persuaded to give up what he loved most. He walked to the window and looked out at the manicured lawn, the driveway glowing under discreet floodlights. He imagined bulldozers instead of trees, glass towers instead of homes. He saw his wife's face as she left it, smiling, tired, telling him not to let the world rush him. Outside, laughter rolled from the dining room, the kind that carried no warmth. He turned back toward the door. His reflection caught in the glass a man smaller than he'd once been, perhaps, but steadier. The humiliation, the ache they had, cooled into something clearer. When he stepped back into the party, Mark spotted him at once. Dad, everything all right? He asked, too quickly. A flicker of panic behind the smile. Samuel met his son's eyes. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Samuel nodded. Everything's fine. He adjusted his blazer, felt the steady pulse of the watch against his chest, and walked toward the dining table, where the silverware gleamed like rows of sharpened truth. He wasn't angry anymore. He was awake. And he knew, with perfect clarity, that he would never sell his house to a man who smiled while stealing time. When Samuel returned to the main hall, the music had shifted to something lighter strings and laughter blending into a polished hum. He walked back through the crowd like a man underwater. The chandelier light fractured across his blazer. His face revealed nothing. Catherine approached him, her smile gracious but strained. Mr. Hayes, you disappeared. Are you all right? He nodded. Just a bit tired. It's been a long day. Of course, she said, touching his arm with polite concern. We've prepared a guest room upstairs if you like to rest. That would be perfect, he said. Across the room, Mark was speaking too quickly to a group of investors. The glow of ambition stretched thin across his features. For a moment, Samuel studied him, the posture, the practiced laughter, the nervous flicker in the eyes. His son had learned the choreography of power, but not the rhythm. When Mark noticed his father looking, the smile faltered. Samuel crossed to him. "Enjoy your evening, son," he said quietly, placing a hand on Mark's shoulder. The words carried warmth on the surface and something else beneath permission, or maybe a warning. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but didn't. Samuel's hand was already gone. He climbed the marble staircase alone. He stepped soundless against the carpet. The noise from the party dimmed behind him until it was just a dull vibration through the floorboards, like the pulse of a distant engine. The guest room was immaculate, sterile in its perfection. A vase of white roses on the nightstand, a heavy velvet curtain drawn against a winter night. On the writing desk, someone had left a glass of water and a folded linen napkin. He closed the door gently and locked it. For the first time that evening, he allowed himself to breathe. He took off the blazer, laid it neatly across a chair, and reached into the inner pocket. The velvet pouch still there. He placed it beside the lamp, the ticking faint but steady. Clara's heartbeat, he thought. Always steady, always waiting for him to act. He crossed to his overnight bag and unzipped a side compartment. Inside was a small black flip phone, an older model, thick, weighty, deliberately untraceable. He'd kept it for years in a drawer at home, untouched except for the quiet ritual of charging it every month. There was only one contact saved, Mr. Davies. The banker had been Clara's friend before he'd been Samuel's. Years ago, after her diagnosis, they sat together at the kitchen table drafting what she called the Nightingale Clause. She'd insisted it sound harmless, even poetic. "No one looks twice at something named after a songbird," she said. The idea was simple but powerful. If ever Samuel faced coercion, blackmail, or financial manipulation, the clause would automatically convert their dormant assets, preferred stocks, long-term bonds, and a sizable insurance endowment into liquid funds. The money would be redistributed into protected trusts and legal instruments designed to block any forced sale of their estate. It was, in essence, a financial firewall. A way to disappear in plain sight. He opened the phone. The screen lit weakly, the way old things do when they're called back to life. He scrolled once, pressed call. The line picked up on the second ring. Davies. The voice was calm, British, cautious. Samuel spoke clearly, each word measured like the tick of a clock. "It's me, Samuel Thorne. Activate protocol Nightingale." A pause. Paper rustled on the other end. "Full protocol, sir?" "Yes, full. Commence immediately." "Understood," Davies said. "Once initiated, reversal isn't possible without both signatures. Yours and Mrs. Thorne's." "I'm aware," Samuel said. His voice didn't tremble. "That's why I'm calling now." A brief silence followed, the sound of a man hesitating before setting a will in motion. Then, "Consider it done, sir. You'll receive confirmation by morning." "Thank you." He ended the call, stared at the small glowing screen for a moment, then pressed and held until it went dark. He deleted the call log, removed the battery, and slipped both pieces back into his bag. It was done. He sat on the edge of the bed, listening. The party was still alive. Below him, music, laughter, the faint echo of clinking glassware. Every sound felt distant now, hollow, as though coming from another life. He loosened his tie and lay back on the crisp white sheets, staring at the ceiling. The chandelier above him threw quiet circles of light that rotated like the hands of a slow, deliberate clock. In his mind, he could hear Clara's voice, low and practical. "Don't shout at time, Sam. Fix the gears." He smiled faintly. She never trusted charm, never trusted the illusion of wealth that came without craftsmanship. That's why they'd build their safety net not on promises, but on rules, hard, verifiable, unbreakable rules. He closed his eyes and let the weight of the day settle. He could feel the house's heartbeat through the floor. Laughter, the soft thud of footsteps, the distant pop of champagne corks. Above it all, his pulse matched the rhythm of the pocket watch on the nightstand. Tick, tick, tick. Downstairs, Mark was still performing for his future, unaware that something far older and steadier had just begun turning against him. The Nightingale Protocol wasn't revenge, it was mathematics. Once triggered, it would quietly unspool the power Alistair thought he held, redirecting every thread of control away from the Hamilton Empire. Within hours, the land deed for Samuel's house would move into a protected trust under federal compliance law. It could no longer be sold, borrowed against, or used in any transaction without his direct authorization. It was invisible warfare, legal, silent, absolute. Samuel rolled onto his side, the lamplight glancing off his face. Below him, someone laughed too loudly. A violin struck a sour note. The sound seemed almost comical now, people celebrating victories they hadn't yet won. He reached over and turned off the lamp. The room fell into darkness, leaving only the faint light leaking through the curtain edges. His eyes stayed open. He wasn't waiting for sleep. He was listening for the quiet hum of the world, recalibrating for the first vibration of the machinery he'd just awakened. Somewhere far from the party, in a bank server room filled with cold fluorescent light, lines of code began to move. And in a ledger that had slept for years, a small notation changed from dormant to active. The gears had begun to turn, and Samuel Thorne, watchmaker, widower, and father, lay perfectly still, counting each second as it passed. The dining room glittered like a stage built for people pretending to love one another. The table stretched the length of a limousine crystal stemware, silver cutlery aligned to military precision, napkins folded into impossible shapes. The smell of roasted lamb mingled with rosemary and tension. Samuel sat halfway down the table, between a banker's wife and a man who kept checking his watch. Across from him, Mark was performing again, laughing too loudly, gesturing with the practiced ease of someone who spent years imitating confidence. At the head sat Alistair Hamilton, silent, inscrutable, carving his meat with the precision of a surgeon. Every sound in the room seemed to take its rhythm from him, the clink of a fork, the pause in conversation, the careful laughter that followed. The conversation turned inevitably toward Phoenix. So, Alistair said without looking up, "Tell us, Mark, how is the project progressing?" Mark's fork froze halfway to his mouth. "It's going very well, sir," he said quickly. "In fact, I've taken care of the final obstacle. Everything's aligning perfectly." A ripple of interest passed along the table. Alistair finally looked up, one eyebrow slightly arched. "Final obstacle?" Mark smiled thinly. "A small matter of property rights. But it's fine. My father understands reason." The sentence landed like a stone in a still pond. The air around Samuel tightened. He didn't look up, just cut a piece of lamb and chewed slowly. "That's good to hear," Alistair said. His tone was mild, but his eyes flicked briefly toward Samuel, studying him the way a scientist studies a specimen that has started to move on its own. Mark relaxed, mistaking silence for approval. "Of course, progress requires difficult choices," he went on. "Sometimes we have to set aside sentiment." Samuel placed his fork down, the sound small but sharp. He smiled faintly, almost kindly. "Yes," he said. "Sometimes sentiment is all that's left." Mark didn't respond. His jaw tightened. The guest turned away, sensing danger but pretending not to see it. The only sound was the delicate scrape of silverware and the soft crackle of the fireplace. Then, as the servers brought in the next course ducking the dark cherry sauce, Samuel reached for the serving bowl. His hand trembled slightly, or perhaps it didn't. Either way, the ladle slipped. A streak of red sauce arced across the white tablecloth and landed on Mark's sleeve. A perfect, dark stain blooming over the expensive fabric. "Oh," Samuel said quietly. "I'm so sorry. Mark pushed his chair back so violently that it screeched against the floor. "Be careful," he shouted. "Can't you see how expensive this outfit is?" The room froze. The only movement came from a woman at the far end, who gasped softly before covering her mouth. "It was an accident," Samuel said, still seated. His voice was calm, but his eyes, those calm, unblinking watchmaker's eyes, were locked on his son. "Accident?" Mark barked, grabbing a napkin, dabbing at his sleeve. "This is typical. You always ruin things and expect people to excuse it." "Mark," Catherine whispered, her voice trembling, "please." But Mark was already leaning forward, eyes blazing with the heat of every unspoken failure. "You don't belong here, Dad," he hissed, loud enough for the room to hear. You never did. You embarrass me. Samuel flinched not from the words, but from the venom behind them. Then, as if to prove his strength, Mark shoved his father's shoulder. The gesture wasn't subtle. It was raw, loud, final. The push knocked Samuel back against his chair. The glass nearest him toppled, spilling red wine across the white cloth, spreading like blood through snow. The entire table seemed to exhale. For a moment, time stopped. Samuel steadied himself, gripping the edge of the table. His face remained composed, almost serene. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move to defend himself. He simply looked at his son long enough for the silence to grow unbearable. "Sit down," Catherine whispered, pale and shaking. "Please, Mark, sit down." Mark turned to Alistair, desperate, as if searching for validation. "See," he said, forcing a laugh. "This is the problem. We're too soft. This is what happens when we let useless people drag us down. You said it yourself, we have to be tough." Alistair didn't move. His knife rested on his plate, untouched. The expression on his face was unreadable, neither anger nor pity, just an appraisal. The silence pressed in on all of them, heavy and suffocating. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "Sit down, Mark." The words carried no emotion, only authority. Mark hesitated, realizing too late that he'd gone too far. He sank back into his chair, face flushed, hands trembling slightly. Samuel adjusted his glasses. His cheekbone ached faintly where the shove had landed. He took a napkin and dabbed the wine off his sleeve. "No harm done," he said softly. "Accidents happen." The irony was so gentle it almost sounded like forgiveness. Around the table, no one spoke. Forks hovered midair. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly. The only sound was the faint hum of a chandelier and the slow, steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Alistair's gaze lingered on Samuel. For the first time that night, there was no condescension in it, only recognition. The smirk was gone. When the servers returned, awkwardly clearing plates, conversation resumed in small, fragile fragments. No one mentioned the incident, but the room had changed. The air was colder, thinner, as if the house itself had drawn a breath and decided to hold it. Samuel finished his meal in silence, his movements calm and deliberate. Mark avoided his eyes now, chewing mechanically, trapped in his own humiliation. Catherine's hand trembled each time she lifted her glass. Across the table, Alistair's gaze drifted between father and son. His expression revealed nothing, but when he finally looked down at his plate, his jaw tightened a tiny sign, almost imperceptible, that the performance he had been watching had not gone as planned. Samuel folded his napkin carefully, aligning the corners. He rose from his chair, every movement slow and steady. "Thank you for dinner," he said. "It's been enlightening." No one replied. He walked from the room, the soft rhythm of his footsteps the only sound. Behind him, the tension hung heavy, like smoke refusing to dissipate. In that silence, something irreversible had happened. The mask had slipped, the performance was over, and somewhere deep inside the Hamilton house, the quiet mechanism of the Nightingale Protocol kept ticking steady, unseen, unstoppable. The world didn't break with a crash. It broke with silence. After Mark's shove, the air in the dining room froze thick, immovable. The only sound was the faint hiss of the fireplace and the quiet roll of a wine glass still spinning to a stop. Every guest at the table sat motionless, mid-breath, as if movement itself might shatter what was left of the night. Samuel remained in his chair, one hand steadying the edge of the table. His tie had twisted slightly from the impact, a small imperfection in an otherwise composed figure. His breathing was even. He didn't look at his son. Mark's chest rose and fell rapidly. "Dad," he started, but his voice cracked. The confidence that had carried him all evening was already slipping. Across the table, Alistair Hamilton didn't move. His knife and fork rested precisely parallel on his plate. His eyes, those cool, appraising eyes that had seen boardrooms burn and empires built, remained fixed on Samuel, not his son. The stillness was unbearable. Even the flames in the fireplace seemed to quiet themselves, waiting. Then, Alistair stood. The sound of his chair sliding back was delicate but final, like the closing of a courtroom door. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even sigh. His movements were slow, deliberate, the kind of slowness that made everyone else hold their breath. He walked around the table, past the frozen faces, past the untouched plates, until he reached Samuel. For a moment, the room believed he would offer help, perhaps an apology on his son-in-law's behalf. He didn't. He stopped beside Samuel, looked down at him for a long moment, and reached out not with pity, but precision. His fingers, steady, immaculate, brushed the knot of Samuel's wool tie. He adjusted it carefully, straightening the line, smoothing the fabric, pressing it once into place. It was an intimate gesture, almost tender, but the tenderness was a weapon. When he was done, Alistair stepped back, his expression unchanged. "The beef Wellington looks a little cold," he said softly, his voice cutting through the silence like the click of a lock. "Please, everyone continue." No one moved. The command hung in the air, absurd and terrifying. A woman near the end of the table nervously reached for her fork, the metal clinking against china. That sound, small, meaningless, seemed to give permission for others to follow. Plates shifted, glasses lifted, people began chewing again, but the act looked grotesque, like a ritual performed under duress. Mark sat motionless. His hand was still on the table, fingers spread, knuckles white. His mouth twitched, searching for words that wouldn't come. "Sir," he began, voice barely a whisper. "I didn't." But Alistair wasn't listening. He had already returned to his seat, lowering himself with quiet elegance. His expression was calm, impassive, the kind of calm that made everyone else tremble. Samuel reached for his napkin and dabbed at the spot of wine that had splashed onto his sleeve. His movements were unhurried, exact. If the shove had hurt him, he didn't show it. If Alistair's gesture had humiliated him, he didn't acknowledge it. He simply resumed his meal, cutting his lamb into neat, precise pieces. For a few unbearable minutes, the table pretended that dinner had resumed. The sound of silverware filled the silence like static. Someone laughed too loudly, then stopped mid-breath. The fire popped once, and every head turned as though it were a gunshot. Mark stared at his plate. His cheeks were red, his pupils starting. He had expected punishment, a raised voice, perhaps a cold dismissal. But this was worse. He had been erased. Alistair's refusal to acknowledge him wasn't mercy. It was a verdict. A ruler didn't argue with failures. He erased them from the record. Catherine sat rigid, her face pale. Her fingers toyed with her wineglass, twisting it back and forth in silence. Across from her, Samuel lifted his own glass, sipped the wine, and set it down with a small, deliberate click. Mark looked to Alistair again, searching for a glance, a word, anything that might restore him to the table. But Alistair was already speaking to the guest on his right about the vintage of the wine, his tone light, almost cheerful. It was the final cruelty, pretending nothing had happened. Then came the sound, a faint vibration on the polished table. Mark's phone, screen down, buzzed once, a short, urgent sound that seemed to fill the room. He reached for it immediately, fumbling, turning it over. One missed call, the display glowed briefly. Davy's bank urgent notification. He froze, thumb hovering over the screen. Then he caught Alistair's eyes flick toward the phone, just once, before returning to his meal. Mark quickly silenced it, face pale. No one else noticed or pretended not to. But Samuel did. He saw everything. The flicker of fear in his son's expression, the quiet authority in Alistair's restraint, the faint tremor that ran through Mark's hand as he slid the phone back into his pocket. The Nightingale Protocol had begun its quiet work. Alistair cut another piece of lamb. "Serene, delicious," he said softly. Mark forced a smile. "Yes, sir. Perfect." Indeed, the word was neutral, but the silence that followed wasn't. It was the silence of a man who had already drawn conclusions and would never speak of them again. When dessert arrived, something delicate with gold leaf and raspberries, nobody touched it. Samuel finished his wine, folded his napkin, and stood. "Thank you," he said quietly, addressing no one in particular. "It's been an evening to remember." The words were polite, almost gentle, but in the stillness that followed, they sounded like a sentence being passed. Alistair inclined his head slightly. "Indeed it has," he replied. As Samuel walked toward the door, he could feel their eyes on him, the guests pretending to eat, the son too stunned to move, the patriarch sitting like a marble statue at the head of the table. He didn't look back. Behind him, the quiet resumed, thicker than ever. The fire hissed. A single drop of wine slid down the stem of a glass. Mark's phone vibrated again, this time twice. He didn't dare check it. And Alistair, the king in his seat, watched him, expressionless, motionless, letting the silence do what it always did best: destroy the unworthy. I bet 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past without clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you, and where are you listening? The first vibration was small, a faint, polite buzz beneath the hum of forced conversation. Mark ignored it. He had been trying to appear calm, to recover from his earlier outburst, to prove to himself, to Alistair, that he was still in control. But the phone buzzed again, and again. He reached under the table, fumbling for his pocket. The screen lit up in harsh blue light. Davies Bank urgent notification. He swiped it away, silenced the call, slipped the phone back, tried to steady his breath. "Everything all right?" asked Catherine softly. Her voice was small, frightened. "Fine," Mark said through his teeth. "It's just work." But then a second phone rang. The work phone, the one he used for clients. Its ringtone, a sharp, clinical trill, cut through the muted murmur of the dining room. Every head turned. Mark grabbed it, fumbling to shut it off, but it slipped from his hand and clattered against the edge of his plate. The sound was sharp enough to make Catherine flinch. "I'm so sorry," he stammered, his face flushed. "It's the markets. You know how they are, always something urgent." The phone started ringing again before he finished the sentence, this time from a different number, and then the email tone sounded. A quick double chime, another, then three in rapid succession. From the sofa in the corner, his tablet still connected to the company network lit up and began vibrating on the cushion, bouncing slightly with each alert. Its screen glowed with a cascade of messages, each subject line identical except for the timestamp: margin call notice, automatic liquidation executed. Mark froze. His hand hung in midair. The words didn't make sense. Not yet. But the repetition, the endless duplication of the same subject line, struck like a heartbeat, speeding out of rhythm. "Mark," Alistair said quietly, "perhaps you should take your call outside." But there was no point now. All three devices were ringing. The phone in his jacket pocket, the work phone on the table, the tablet still buzzing. A cacophony of mechanical panic, one layered over another until it filled the room. He stood abruptly, knocking over his wineglass. The deep red spread across a pristine white tablecloth, blooming outward like a wound. "Oh God," whispered Catherine, reaching for napkins. "Mark, stop, just stop." He didn't hear her. He grabbed his main phone again. The screen was flashing red. Portfolio alert, immediate action required. He opened the trading app. Numbers scrolled faster than he could read them. Each refresh bled more red into the page. Auto liquidation in progress, position closed, collateral breach. "No," he muttered. No, that's not possible." Guests were whispering now, leaning toward each other, some in pity, others in fascination. The spectacle was too strange, too modern, too cruel to look away from. "Is he all right?" someone whispered. Alistair hadn't moved. He watched quietly, his knife and fork still resting on his plate, as though this chaos were simply part of the entertainment. "Mark," he said, his voice even, "you're making a scene." Mark looked up, wild-eyed. "It's a system error. It has to be. It's the brokers, they're overreacting. But another sound cut him off, a chorus of pings from his email, one after another, in perfect rhythm. Each subject line hit like a note in a growing symphony. Automatic closure notice, margin shortfall, account suspended, and vibrate, and vibrate, and vibrate. It was relentless now. His phone rang, then the backup, then the tablet chimed, all overlapping until the sound filled every corner of the room like 1,000 tiny hammers. Mark pressed his palms to his ears, but it didn't help. "Turn it off," he snapped, though no one had touched anything. "Just turn it off." He reached for the tablet, grabbed it off the sofa, and in the motion, his sleeve caught another wineglass. It fell, shattered, crimson splattering across the floor and the guest's shoes. Catherine gasped, tears spilling. Please, stop. You're embarrassing yourself. I'm losing everything, he shouted, the words raw, too loud, tearing through the silence like an animal cry. The sentence hung in the air, obscene in its truth. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then the next phone call came. The ringtone was different this time, a low corporate chime. The screen read, Hamilton Group Holding. Alistair's brow furrowed. He glanced at Mark, who looked at the phone as if it might bite him. The call went unanswered. Then another arrived immediately after from the same number. An investment banker seated near the end of the table leaned toward Alistair and whispered something. The older man's expression changed, barely. His jaw tightened. His hand, resting on the table, curled once into a fist before relaxing again. The whisper spread. Words like collapse and margin call floated across the table like ghosts. Mark sank back into his chair, the devices still vibrating around him. His face had gone pale, his mouth slightly open. Dad, he said, his voice breaking. Dad, I don't understand what's happening. But Samuel said nothing. He sat at the far end of the table, perfectly still, cutting a piece of cold beef Wellington. His movements were calm, deliberate. The only sound from his side of the table was the quiet scrape of his knife against porcelain. Mark's breathing quickened. It's all gone, he whispered. Everything. The last vibration died out. The room was finally silent, except for the faint hum of the chandelier. Alistair leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. For the first time all evening, he looked not angry, but disappointed. The kind of disappointment that ended partnerships, erased names, ended legacies. Mark tried to speak, but his throat closed. Catherine was crying softly. The guests were pretending to look away, their forks poised above untouched plates. And Samuel, at the opposite end, finally set down his utensils and dabbed his lips with a napkin. Strange, he said quietly, almost to himself. How quickly the world moves when it's time. No one answered. The silence that followed wasn't just heavy, it was terminal. Outside, faintly through the frost-tinted window, the church bells of the town square began to chime 9 times. Each one felt like another margin call, another verdict, another piece of the world collapsing on cue. The room was chaos wrapped in velvet. Phones still blinked with silent warnings, glasses trembled in half-drunk hands, and Mark sat slumped at the head of the table, color draining from his face. His world had fallen apart in front of a dozen people pretending not to stare. Then Alistair Hamilton raised a single hand. The movement was small but absolute. Every sound, every whisper, every nervous breath, even the faint background music stopped mid-note. The quiet that followed was so heavy it felt physical. Mark's breathing came in sharp, shallow bursts. His suit jacket hung unevenly, one sleeve soaked in spilled wine. He looked like a man who'd been dragged out of a wreck and sat back down at dinner before anyone had time to clean him up. Alistair's voice broke the silence. Calm, measured. Is that, he asked, how you manage your money? The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. The rhetorical question landed harder than any scream could. Mark swallowed, trying to find language inside the ruin of his throat. Sir, I can explain. It's a system malfunction, a market. Alistair lifted a hand, and the words died. Stop. He rose from his seat with the deliberate precision of a man accustomed to command. His movements were slow, almost ceremonial. The guests leaned back instinctively, creating space for him without realizing it. The dining table had become a courtroom, and Alistair the judge presiding over its verdict. He walked to the other end of the table and stopped beside his son-in-law. Mark stared down at his plate, too afraid to look up. Project Phoenix, Alistair said, his tone almost curious. It was meant to rise from the ashes, wasn't it? And yet, here we are, ashes first. He glanced toward Samuel, who sat quietly at the far end, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to Mark. Our partnership, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, is terminated, effective immediately. And so I loathe time. Mark's head snapped up. No, you can't please, this is just a temporary. Alistair ignored him. He straightened his cufflinks, adjusted his jacket, and looked toward his daughter. Catherine. For a moment, she didn't move. Her fingers clutched the edge of her napkin, twisting it into a knot. The silence stretched, cruel and theatrical. Then she stood, her chair sliding back across the polished floor with a long, mournful scrape. She didn't look at Mark. Instead, she walked slowly around the table and stopped beside her father. The movement, graceful, practice. Without a word, she placed a hand on his arm, a gesture that said everything. "Catherine," Mark said, his voice trembling, "please, don't do this here." Her expression was composed, her eyes distant. "My lawyer will contact you tomorrow morning," she said quietly. "This marriage is over." The sentence was short, administrative, final. She could have been canceling a contract. Mark blinked as if he hadn't heard her correctly. "What?" She didn't repeat herself. When she finally looked at him, it was with the calm pity one reserves for a stranger's misfortune. Then she turned back to her father. Alistair nodded once, satisfied. "Thank you, darling," he said softly, like a teacher acknowledging a well-done task. The entire table had gone rigid. One woman discreetly reached for her husband's hand under the table. Another guest lowered her gaze, pretending to study her plate, as though etiquette could shield her from witnessing the fall of a man. Mark stood abruptly. The chair toppled behind him. His hands trembled. "You can't just erase me like this. You needed me, my connections, my work." Alistair didn't reply. He sat back down, lifted his wineglass, and took a measured sip. "We needed competence," he said, "and discretion. You have demonstrated neither." Mark's voice cracked. "Catherine, please say something." She didn't. Her silence was worse than anger. It was absence, the absence of love, of loyalty, of anything human. Mark's eyes darted towards Samuel, the last familiar face in a room that had turned against him. "Dad," he whispered, broken. Tell them this isn't fair." Samuel looked at him. His expression was calm, almost kind. There was no triumph in his eyes, only an unbearable sadness. "I told you once," Samuel said softly, "that everything you build on someone else's approval will crumble the moment they withdraw it. Dad, But the words fell apart before they could reach meaning. Alistair placed his napkin neatly beside his plate. "Mr. Hayes," he said to Samuel, in a tone of polite detachment, "thank you for joining us tonight. I apologize for the unpleasantness." Samuel inclined his head. "No apology needed." He stood slowly, leaving his half-finished wine behind, and looked once more at his son. "You'll understand someday," he said quietly. Mark opened his mouth, but nothing came. His body swayed slightly, as though the gravity in the room had shifted. Then, as if his legs could no longer hold the weight of humiliation, he sank to the floor. The sound of his knees hitting the hardwood was small but final. Catherine turned away. Alistair didn't look down. The guests began to murmur soft, embarrassed sounds of people desperate to pretend this wasn't happening. The pianist, unsure, started to play again, the melody thin and shaky. Samuel walked toward the door, his footsteps steady. Behind him, he heard the faint sound of Mark's breath hitching, the strangled sob of a man who'd realized too late that the stage he built had always belonged to someone else. When Samuel reached the doorway, he paused. The reflection in the glass showed Alistair sitting tall, Catherine standing behind him, and Mark collapsed, silent, invisible. It was, in every way, a perfect portrait of the Hamilton family. Outside, the night was cold, sharp, honest. Samuel pulled his coat tighter around him and walked into it, the sound of the door closing behind him like the last tick of a stopped clock. Inside, no one spoke his name. No one spoke Mark's either. The dinner resumed stiff, mechanical, as if nothing had happened. Only one chair remained empty. The night had thinned into something brittle and airless by the time the last guest left. The laughter that had once filled the Hamilton mansion had evaporated into silence, leaving only the faint crackle of the fire and the clink of glassware being cleared by staff too polite to meet anyone's eyes. Samuel stood in the entryway, coat in hand, when Alistair's voice came from behind him. "Mr. Hayes," he said quietly. "A moment, if you would." Samuel turned. Alistair stood by the doorway to the library, the same room where their first conversation had taken place, the same room where the trap had been set. For a second, Samuel considered refusing, but something in Alistair's tone, not command, not threat, but wariness, made him follow. The library looked different now. The brandy glasses from earlier had been replaced with 2 fresh ones. The light was dimmer, the fire lower, its orange glow painting both men in tired warmth. Alistair gestured to a chair. "Sit," he said. Samuel did. For a moment, neither spoke. The quiet between them was not the awkward kind. It was the quiet of 2 men too old to waste words. Finally, Alistair poured 2 fingers of brandy into each glass and pushed one across the desk. "I owe you this," he said. Samuel looked at it but didn't reach for it. "I'm not sure you owe me anything." 空灯的sang the sigh. Alistair smiled faintly. "Oh, but I do. You've just dismantled one of my most promising partnerships, and, in the process, my son-in-law's entire reputation. If that's not a debt, I don't know what is." The sarcasm faded as quickly as it came. He sank into his chair, rubbing his temple. "You know," he said, "I tried to like him. I gave him every chance to prove himself a wolf. But in the end, he was just a sheep trying to wear wolf's clothing." Samuel said nothing. Alistair leaned forward, staring into the fire. "I can accept a smart loser. I can't stomach a cruel fool. The way he treated you tonight, that wasn't strength. That was desperation, pretending to be power." Samuel exhaled slowly. "He wanted your respect. That's all he's ever wanted from anyone, really." "I don't give respect easily," Alistair said, "and certainly not to men who mistake arrogance for courage." He took a sip of his drink, then set it down, untouched afterward. "When he pushed you, his jaw tightened. That was the end. I would have destroyed him anyway, but I didn't expect you to destroy him better than I could." "I didn't destroy him," Samuel said quietly. "He did that himself." "True," Alistair said, "but you lit the fuse." Samuel allowed himself a faint, weary smile. "Perhaps, though I imagine it was already smoldering long before I arrived." For the first time that night, Alistair looked directly at him. There was no contempt in his gaze now, no smugness, only a strange kind of recognition. "You know," he said, "I thought of you as a relic, a sentimental craftsman clinging to an old house and older values. But you, Mr. Hayes, you played the long game better than I did. I wasn't playing a game." "That's what makes it worse," Alistair murmured. "You were being yourself. That's what won." He opened the drawer and pulled out a manila folder, thin, crisp, with a red seal at the corner. He held it up between 2 fingers. "The mortgage note," he said. "Your son used it as leverage to impress me. Told me he could persuade you to part with your land. I was half curious to see if he could." He placed the folder on the desk, then tore it cleanly in half. The paper ripped with a sharp, satisfying sound of closure. He dropped the halves into the fire, watching as they curled and blackened. "There," he said softly. "Debt paid. House yours. And that is the show lot in the Bruges." Samuel watched the flames swallow the paper. The firelight caught his glasses, masking his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but low. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," Alistair said. "I did. Not for you. For me. I don't keep trophies of mistakes." He poured himself another drink, but didn't offer one this time. "You won, Samuel," he said quietly. "Not because you have more money, because you know what's really worth something." Samuel finally reached for his glass. He lifted it slightly, as if toasting an unspoken truth. "And what's that?" "Dignity," Alistair said. "The last currency that still holds its value." They drank in silence. The fire popped once, startling neither of them. After a long moment, Alistair spoke again, softer now. "You and we both failed our sons, didn't we?" Samuel nodded. "In different ways, yes. I tried to make mine ruthless," Alistair said. "You tried to make yours kind. Maybe neither of us realize how easy it is for a man to lose his compass once he starts chasing someone else's definition of success." "Maybe," Samuel said. "Or maybe we just taught them too late what it meant to stand on their own." Alistair sighed. "A cruel world for men like us, Samuel. Too old to start over, too stubborn to change." "I have found stubbornness has its uses," Samuel said. Alistair smiled faintly. "Apparently. If you only—" They sat in silence again. 2 old men framed by the glow of a dying fire. the ghosts of their sons' ambitions flickering in the embers. At last, Samuel set his glass down. "It's late," he said, "and I've got a long drive ahead." Alistair nodded, rising. "You'll find your account restored, and I'll see that your son receives enough to start over, though I doubt he'll know what to do with it." Samuel paused at the doorway. "Don't do that for him." Alistair tilted his head. "Why not?" "Because he needs to fall," Samuel said, "and get up by himself. You and we've both done enough rescuing." For the first time, Alistair actually laughed. It was a small, dry sound, but real. "Perhaps you're right," he said, "though I doubt he'll ever learn to fix anything the way you fix watches." Samuel smiled, a tired, knowing smile. Some things can't be fixed, only understood. He turned to leave. Behind him, Alistair called out one last time. "Samuel." He stopped. "You said earlier that time doesn't forgive. Do you still believe that?" Samuel looked back, eyes soft. "No," he said. "I think time just forgets the wrong things." Alistair nodded once, as if accepting a verdict. When Samuel stepped out of the library, the mansion was quiet again. The last of the staff had gone. The only sound was the ticking of a distant clock, steady, relentless, familiar. He walked into the cold night where his car waited, and for the first time in years, he didn't look back. Behind him, Alistair poured another glass and stared into the fire, where the last fragments of the mortgage note turned to ash. 2 fathers, 2 empires, 2 ruins. And between them, the faintest glimmer of respect earned the hard way, and far too late. I bet 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past without clicking, like, or subscribe, even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you? And where are you listening? By early spring, Samuel's workshop had resumed its quiet pulse of routine. The air inside was warmer now, touched with a faint sweetness of linseed oil and brass polish. Light pooled on the workbench, soft and patient, sliding across the neat rows of screwdrivers and tweezers, like a cat finding its favorite place to rest. The clocks along the wall ticked in uneven unison, each one keeping its own imperfect rhythm. Together, they made a sound that was not quite music, but something close and old house breathing. It had been 3 months since the dinner, since that night of shouting, silence, and collapse. Samuel no longer thought about it often. Or, perhaps more accurately, he thought about it in the same way a man thinks about an old scar, an ache that flares only when the weather changes. He had found his peace in small rituals. Morning tea steeped exactly 4 minutes. The same navy sweater he'd worn for years, soft at the elbows. The smell of the first solder burn of the day. These were the little anchors that kept the present from drifting backward. On the bench before him lay a pocket watch from 1929 gold casing, hairline crack in the glass, initials nearly rubbed away. A wedding gift, the owner had said, voice trembling a little. Samuel turned it carefully in his palm. A faint reflection of his own lined face rippled across the glass. He set to work. The magnifier pressed against his temple, cool and familiar. Gears gleamed like coins at the bottom of a fountain. He brushed away a thread of dust, adjusted the escapement, and held his breath as the mechanism found its voice again. The first tick was quiet. The next was stronger. The third filled the room like a heartbeat rediscovered. He smiled, not widely but truthfully, and let out a small exhale of satisfaction. Fixing things still made sense to him. People rarely did. The bell over the front door jingled 3 bright notes. Mr. Alvarez from the barber shop stepped in, carrying his old mental clock in both hands like a sleeping child. "Running slow again," he said, half apologetic. Samuel nodded. "Bring it back Friday. I'll make sure it remembers what time looks like." The 2 men shared a smile. Mr. Alvarez left with a wave, the door shutting behind him, returning the room to its steady rhythm. Then came another sound, the metallic flap of the mail slot. A soft plunk, 1 envelope, 1 postcard. He wiped his hands and went to pick it up. The front showed a stretch of dusty road, telephone poles leaning into a wide western sky, the words Grand Junction, Colorado printed neatly at the bottom. He turned it over. There was no return address, only handwriting he recognized instantly. The same looping letters that had filled grocery lists and Mother's Day cards decades ago, only smaller now, humbled. The ink had bled slightly in one corner, as though written with shaking hands. "I'm learning to repair things," it said. "Starting with the smallest things." That was all. No signature, no apology, no plea. Samuel stood still for a long time, the card balanced lightly between his fingers. The workshop's ticking grew louder in the quiet clocks, marking seconds that felt unusually deliberate. He set the postcard on the bench beside the wedding watch and sat down slowly. He tried to imagine it, his son, Mark, somewhere in Colorado, in a place with more sky than people. Maybe he had found a mechanic's shop willing to take him on. Maybe he swept the floor. Maybe he was learning the slow grace of tightening a screw until it was snug but not too tight. The humility of precision. The patience of craft. Samuel reached for the velvet pouch beside his lamp, the one that held Clara's pocket watch. He opened it, ran a thumb over the engraving she had made herself years ago. C.H. Love Always. The metal was warm from his touch, the glass unblemished. It had survived every storm. He placed it next to the postcard. The two objects, the watch and the card, sat side by side under the same circle of light. One flawless, one stained. Together, they made something complete. For the first time in months, Samuel felt something shift inside him. Not joy he was too old for that kind of sudden weather, but something quieter, steadier. Forgiveness, maybe. Or at least the beginning of it. He leaned back, listening. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was constant, impartial, reassuring. He thought of Mark as a boy, sitting cross-legged on the workshop floor, sorting screws by size into little jars. Clara had stood in the doorway back then, her smile, half amusement, half pride. "He has your patience," she said. Maybe he still did, somewhere beneath the noise and the years and the hunger for approval that had ruined him. Maybe he was learning that patience again, one stripped gear at a time. The afternoon light deepened. Shadows from the clocks reached across the wall like slow-moving rivers. Samuel made tea, forgot it on the counter, then drank it cold without caring. He adjusted a few dials, checked the regulator clock, then turned the open sign to closed. But he didn't leave. Not yet. He sat at the bench again and picked up the postcard once more. He flipped it over, tracing the black letters with his thumb until the words became almost illegible from repetition. Starting with the smallest things, he could hear Clara's voice, teasing and tender. "That's how everything begins, Sam. You fix what's small. Then one day, you realize the big things aren't broken anymore." He smiled faintly, folded the card once, and slid it under the velvet pouch. Not hidden, not displayed, just resting there. Outside, the sky dimmed into the slow blue of early evening. The bakery next door turned off its lights. Someone across the street locked their shop. The town settled into its end-of-day rhythm, the same rhythm it had always known. Inside, the clocks continued steady, stubborn, merciful. Their overlapping ticks made a sound like rain beginning far away. Samuel stood, turned off the desk lamp, and let the room fall into half-darkness. The postcard and the pocket watch still caught what little light remained, glinting like two small promises that time had not erased. He put on his coat, locked the front door, and stepped out into the cool evening. The air smelled faintly of rain and bread. Across the street, the church bell chimed 6 times. He paused on the sidewalk, listening. For a moment, he wasn't sure if the sound came from the bell or from the workshop behind him, the chorus of ticking clocks, the heartbeat of everything he had kept alive. He slipped his hands into his coat pockets. His fingers brushed against the outline of a small screwdriver he had forgotten to put away. He smiled to himself. There was always something left to fix. As he walked home, the street lamps blinked on one by one, following him like a patient escort. He thought again of Mark alone, perhaps scared, but trying. He pictured him hunched over a watch or a clock or even just a broken hinge, muttering to himself, learning the quiet rhythm of repair. And in that image, for the first time, Samuel felt something that might have been peace. He kept walking, slow and steady, each step falling in time with the echo of his shop. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The steady sound of a heart still working. He didn't need to write back. The silence between them would do what words could not. Some things, he knew, took time to mend, and time, at long last, was on their side.